The transport docked at Vithian Residential Quarter 12 at 600 station time, and Jersey Malik walked down the boarding ramp carrying one bag, one cane he didn't strictly need, and the particular silence of a man who has been told, very politely, that he is no longer required. He was 64 years old. He had spent 31 years in alien contact work, longer than any other human in the service. He spoke 4 Vithian dialects, 2 Keth trade pidgins, and the formal court language of the Oran succession, which was considered by most linguists to be essentially unlearnable by non-native speakers, and which Jersey had learned in 18 months through a combination of documented effort, and what his supervisor at the time had called stubbornness masquerading as aptitude. He spoke those languages the way a person speaks a language they have loved without being loved back, fluently, and with grief. He had brokered the Pale Station Accords. He had talked a Vithian fleet commander down from orbital bombardment over a misunderstanding about territorial water rights that nearly ended the whole human experiment in this sector of space, which was a sentence he had never included in any official report, because the official reports were for posterity, and posterity would want to believe it had been more deliberate than it was. He had done these things in rooms that smelled like ammonia and ozone, surrounded by beings who found human body temperature mildly offensive, and he had never, in 31 years, failed to bring someone to a table they hadn't planned to sit at. He was here now because his lungs had residual inflammation from a contact zone atmosphere leak 18 months ago. Nothing life-threatening, the doctors had said. Nothing that required desk duty, the administrative board had said. Nothing that prevented full reinstatement once recovery was complete, his supervisor had said, in the careful tone of someone composing a sentence around the word never without using it. The doctors were probably right about the first claim. The board was probably lying about the second. His supervisor's particular hesitation on the word complete had told Jersey everything he needed to know about how complete the service expected the recovery to be. Quarter 12 was a human habitation block inside the Vithian imperial capital, a cluster of pressurized corridors and gravity-adjusted common spaces built into the east wing of what the Vithians called the Palace of Extended Consideration, which was a diplomatic name for what humans had been calling, for 30 years, the waiting room. It housed 47 humans, retired translators, former attachés, 3 ex-contact specialists, and 1 retired xenobiologist who had been there so long, she'd started to smell faintly of the Vithian chemical speak they call ambient declaration. These were people the Vithian Empire had found useful once, and had retained, the way you retain a very good pen that has run out of ink, not from sentiment, but because there was no efficient mechanism for disposal, and because throwing it away felt, at some level, like an admission that you hadn't gotten quite enough use out of it. The administrator who met Jersey at the dock was a Vithian of middle rank, 4 arms folded in the pattern of formal polite, the bioluminescent patches along their neck glowing a dim, institutional gold that meant duty rather than warmth. Specialist Malik, it said, in accented but serviceable standard. You will be assigned to Corridor 7. Meals are at standard intervals. Medical review weekly. You are welcome to use the common areas. And the garden, Jersey said. The administrator paused. It was a small pause, the kind that means a query has reached a subclause the speaker hadn't expected to activate. The garden is within the observation range of the inner court. Human occupants of Quarter 12 are asked not to linger in view of the court, not to address members of the imperial family or their staff without formal appointment, and not to. I know, Jersey said. I've read the protocols, I'll stay on the path. He had no intention of staying on the path. Not in the way the protocols meant. He had spent 31 years on paths not quite where the protocols said he should be, and the distinction he had found was the whole of the work. Corridor 7 smelled like recycled air and someone's attempt to grow basil under a grow lamp that wasn't quite the right spectrum. Jersey found his room, set his bag on the narrow bed, and spent 3 minutes looking at the wall before he went to find out who else was here. He found them in the common area at the end of the block, a long room with too bright lighting and furniture that had been sized for humans by Vithian designers who had measured human bodies, but never quite understood human posture. There were 8 of them around the central table. An old woman with the careful posture of someone whose joints had reached private terms with gravity was playing cards with a man whose hands shook slightly, but shuffled perfectly, and with the automatic confidence of someone who has done one thing for so many decades, it has become the most reliable fact about him. A translator Jersey recognized Basia Noack, who had been at the Keth negotiation table in 31, and who had been, at that table, the sharpest mind in the room including his own, sat in the corner reading something on a screen, her fingers moving over the text like she was still marking passages for a briefing that would never be requested. 2 others slept in chairs. One man stood by the window, looking out at the Vithian city with the particular expression of someone who gave up expecting anything a long time ago and has not yet found a reason to revise that policy. Jersey set his cane against a chair and sat down. "Malik," said the card shuffler without looking up. His name was Florian Skarach. He'd been second translator on the Pale Station Accords, which meant Jersey had worked with him for 4 months in a sealed room, and they knew each other the way you know someone you've survived something with completely, without sentiment, and with a trust that had never been explicitly articulated because it didn't need to be. "Heard they finally caught you." "I caught myself," Jersey said, deliberately inhaled a non-standard atmosphere. "Just to get some peace." "How's that working?" "Very peaceful, slightly less oxygen than ideal." Basia didn't look up from her screen. "How bad are your lungs?" "Good enough." "Good enough for what?" He considered this. Outside, through the window at the far end of the room, the pale gold light of the Vithian capital moved across surfaces that were not built to accommodate it, the smooth, pressurized walls, the generic furniture, the basil that was trying. "I haven't decided yet," he said. This, he found, was true. He spent the first week watching. Quarter 12 had its rhythms, and they were the rhythms of people who had given up expecting anything to interrupt them. Meals at standard intervals, eaten without ceremony. Medical checks conducted by a Vithian physician who was professionally kind and personally baffled by human physiology, in the way that all Vithian medical personnel were baffled by it. Not ignorant, just continuously surprised that anything so inefficiently designed continued to function. The occasional communication from family on the outside, played on personal screens with the careful privacy of people who didn't want anyone else to see how much they missed ordinary air and ordinary gravity and ordinary noise. Card games in the common room. The old xenobiologist, whose name was Zofia Wilksinska, and who was 81 years old and moved through quarter 12 as if she owned it, cataloging something in a notebook she had been maintaining since before Jersey was born, and which she refused to discuss in any language anyone could speak. Florian, shuffling cards and reading the room in the way of someone who reads rooms so habitually he no longer knows he's doing it. What Jersey was watching was the garden. From the window at the end of corridor 7, on clear days when the inner court's atmospheric filters were running at low capacity, and the decorative screen wasn't at full opacity, you could see through to a strip of palace garden, actual Vithian cultivated space, which looked like something between a coral reef and a library. Structured growth in shapes that conveyed information as much as they conveyed beauty. Rows of meaning-bearing cultivation, the Vithians' habit of building language into living things taken so far that the garden itself was a kind of sentence about the nature of the place it decorated. And beyond the garden, occasionally, if you were patient and you looked at the right time of day, movement. A Vithian child. Young, very young, by Vithian standards, which compressed the years differently than human development did. So that 9 by their count was an age of genuine intellectual formation, but social and emotional volatility that reminded Jersey, always, of 12 or 13 by human reckoning. The bioluminescent patches on her neck and upper arms were still irregular, still developing the structured patterns that adult Vithians used for controlled ambient declaration. On this child they flickered freely, gold and blue-green, and something between the two that had no standard translation. The unsuppressed broadcast of a very young person who had not yet learned to control what they were feeling and was not entirely sure they wanted to. She was small. She wore the structured fabric robes of someone in the imperial family, or close to it, and she moved through the garden the way children move through places they are technically allowed to be. But no, they probably shouldn't linger in, quickly when in the open, slowly and with great absorption when behind something that might plausibly give cover, and with a total absence of the studied casualness that would have been the giveaway that she was trying to appear unconcerned. She watched the human quarter. Not casually. Not the way Vithian adults watched, which was the careful, assessing look of beings who wanted information, and were also monitoring their own data gathering to make sure it was appropriate to their station and consistent with established protocols, and not likely to generate the wrong kind of ambient declaration in a room full of people trained to read it. She watched the way children watch things that fascinate them, openly, hungrily, and with absolutely no diplomatic filter at all. Jersey caught her eye on the 4th day. She went immediately still, the full-body stillness of a child caught doing something they believed was private. Her neck patches flared to a startled yellow. Then, very slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to acknowledge a situation rather than pretend it hasn't occurred, she brought her upper right hand up in what Jersey recognized as a Vithian gesture of informal greeting, the kind used between people of the same social stratum, the equivalent of a small wave. Not the gesture used between an imperial child and a human resident of a welfare block, which was not a gesture that officially existed in the protocol registers, because the protocol registers did not envision it being necessary. He raised one hand back, just one, palm out. She stared at that for a long time, at his hand, at his face, at the specific configuration of a human body seen through a garden screen at middle distance, and then disappeared behind the decorative lattice. She was back the next morning. "You're going to get us all relocated," Basia said, without looking up from her screen. She came back. Of course she came back. Children always come back when an adult doesn't immediately perform for them or tell them to leave. You manage to simply be, which is harder than it sounds, and children recognize it. She turned a page. "She's been watching the quarter for months. Zofia counted 8 sightings before you arrived. Ask Florian, he keeps a log." Jersey looked at Florian, who was shuffling cards with the slightly elevated attention of someone pretending not to be paying attention. "She always watches from the garden screen," Florian said. "Never from the observation deck on the south side. The deck is official. There's a registered protocol for Vithian personnel observing human residential areas for authorized cultural exchange purposes. The garden is hers. She goes there when she wants to not be watched while she watches." He fanned the cards, collapsed them with a sound like a single clean breath. "She started coming more regularly after old Henrik started singing to himself in the corridor. You remember how he used to sing? That thing he always did, the old song from Mazos, the one he said he didn't know the words to properly, but it didn't matter because it was the tune that did the work. She used to come every morning when he sang." Jersey was quiet for a moment. "Henrik died 2 months ago," Florian said. "She still comes, just not as early." He looked at the cards in his hands. "She watches differently now. She used to watch us the way you watch something that's making a sound you want to understand. Now she watches the way you watch something you're afraid will stop." "What's her name?" Jersey asked. "Sale," Basia said. She had finally put her screen down. Third daughter of the Empress Rithal, 9 years old by Vithian count. She is, incidentally, the reason this quarter has not been formally decommissioned. She said this with the precise delivery of someone who has been saving a piece of information for the right moment and has correctly identified that moment as now. The Empress has extended our administrative review 3 times without giving a formal reason. The office has requested closure twice. Twice, it has been postponed. The third time, the Empress signed a personal directorate extending the Quarter 12 charter for an additional review cycle. No reason given. She looked at Jersey. There's a pattern. You can see it or you can ignore it. Most people here have chosen to not look directly at it. Because looking at it means thinking about what it would mean if it stopped, Zofia said, without looking up from her notebook. The table was quiet. So whatever you're planning, Basia said, think carefully. I'm thinking of putting on a show, Jersey said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have been waiting for something to be said, who did not know they were waiting for it, and who are now rearranging everything they thought they knew about the last few months in light of it. He proposed it formally at dinner, and the objections were exactly what he expected. Reasonable, comprehensive, and all essentially the same objection in different clothes, which was that none of them knew what they were doing, and this seemed like a bad time to discover it. We're not performers, Victor said. Victor had spent 20 years as administrative support for the Human Delegation's third-tier outreach office, and he had the permanently slightly defensive posture of someone whose job had been to explain other people's decisions to other people's superiors. He was good at objecting. He had been objecting professionally since before Jersey was born. Some of us were, Zofia said. She said it quietly, still looking at her notebook, in the tone of someone saying something true that they have not said in a long time. Before xenobiology, I trained at the Warsaw Conservatory, string quartet. I was good enough to be told I wasn't good enough, which is the conservatory's way of telling you that you might be good enough but not today. She paused. I have been cataloging the ambient chemical language of Vithian cultivar species for 40 years. I believe I can manage accompaniment. Jersey looked at her. She had not looked up. Basia trained in the Diplomatic Theater Corps, he said. They ran it in the first decade after contact, cultural exchange, formal demonstration that humans had artistic traditions worth taking seriously. I read the program records. You've been researching us, Basia said. I've been learning what's here. Basia considered this. She had the look of someone deciding whether to object on principle to being researched, and concluding that the principle was less interesting than the result. What would we do, she said. Go, Jersey said, Faust. Victor opened his mouth. Not the full production, Jersey said. The bones of it, the argument it makes. Faust is the story of a man who has done everything worth doing and been told by the world, by time, by forces that present themselves as helpful, that he is finished. That his best was his best, and it was some time ago, and now he should graciously accept the condition of the already completed. And the argument the play makes, the argument Goethe spent his whole life making, is that the only moment worth asking to last is the one where you're still reaching, still making, still insisting on more. He looked at the table, at the people around it, at the basil grow lamp and the too bright light and the window where outside the Vithian capital did its alien work. It's not a comfortable argument. It requires something from the people performing it. It requires them to mean it. He let that sit. She's watching the quarter, he said, from behind a garden screen because we have something she recognizes that she cannot get from her own world. I don't know exactly what it is, but I think she'd recognize Faust. Another silence. Then Florian, still shuffling, said without looking up, I have the musical archives from the full-service catalog. 40 years of human music, scored and cataloged for cultural exchange purposes. I know what goes where. It was the most he'd committed to out loud in months. Then we do Faust, Zofia said. They had 3 weeks before the next administrative review. Jersey did not tell anyone about the review. He suspected most of them knew. The people of Quarter 12 had been watching administrative calendars for years. It was one of the skills you developed when your continued existence depended on bureaucratic patience. They rehearsed every evening after dinner, pushing the furniture back against the walls of the common room and working with what they had, which was considerable if you knew how to count it. A trained performer in Basia who had spent 40 years pretending not to be one. A musician in Zofia who had spent the same time converting her training into something that looked like science. A man in Victor who had discovered he was very good at playing an authority that explained why things couldn't be done. And a sound engineer in Florian who had never held the title but had been doing the work since before the title existed in this context. Jersey played Faust. He was not a trained actor. He had been something else, which was a diplomat, and a diplomat's performance is built on the opposite principle from an actor's, not to be seen to perform, but to make performance so complete it vanishes into apparent sincerity. What this meant in practice was that when Jersey stood in the common room of Quarter 12 with the furniture pushed back, and the grow lamp humming its single note and Florian's tablet providing what it could of the musical scaffolding, and he spoke the words Gothe's words, or his memory of them, or the versions that his memory had composed from imperfect retention. He did not perform them as if he was an actor playing a character. He spoke them as a person who understood what they were made of. He knew what Faust was made of. He had felt it in the specific way you feel something when it is also about you. The first week, they stumbled. Basia's knee was bad, and she moved like she was negotiating a treaty with her own body. Victor kept speaking his lines in the careful tone of administrative explanation that made Mephistopheles sound less like a devil and more like an extremely patient internal review process. Zofia played things that were near the score without being the score, and the nearness was right. It was the emotional shape of the music rather than the notes, which was what they needed. Florian ran the sound and watched the garden window. He had positioned himself so he could see the screen from his station. "She watches more on the days we rehearse," he said one evening, not looking up from his tablet. "She comes to the screen at the time we start. She stays until we stop." "Does she understand what she's seeing?" Victor asked. "No," Jersey said, "but she understands something about it." He had spent 31 years with beings for whom understanding and recognition were not the same thing. The Vithians had understood humans for decades, had them catalogued, studied, documented, their languages and histories and biological processes known to a resolution that humans couldn't achieve in the other direction. They understood, but recognition was different. Recognition required something to respond to in you, not just information about the thing you were observing. That was what the child had, recognition. That was what he was trying to give her, something worth recognizing. On the 9th evening of rehearsal, something happened that nobody planned for. They were running the end of Act 2, the moment that Goethe built everything toward, the moment that was the hinge of the entire argument. Faust has been given everything he ever wanted: youth, love, power, knowledge without limit. He has been given the world and the opportunity to declare that this exact moment, is enough, which would be the fulfillment of the deal, the moment Mephistopheles wins. And instead of declaring it, instead of accepting the gift and surrendering the one thing that is genuinely his insistence on more, his refusal to be complete, Faust says the lines that are the argument of the play in its purest form. He speaks of a moment so beautiful, so full, that he could ask it to stay. But he speaks of it in the future tense. He speaks of the hope of that moment, not its arrival. He refuses to surrender even here. "Stay, thou art so fair." Jersey spoke those lines in the common room, to the pushed-back furniture and the basil grow lamp, and the people who were all in their ways, the argument the play was making. He spoke them into the middle distance, the way you speak something true, not at anyone, not for effect, but into the air because the air is the closest thing to everywhere you can reach. and from beyond the garden screen in the dark, there came a sound. It was brief, unguarded, the sound a child makes when something touches them before they have time to prepare for being touched by it. It was Vithian in its register, not a word, not ambient declaration, but something below declaration, something that existed before language, in the place where language comes from. They all heard it. Nobody reacted, because the instinct they shared, the instinct that 30 years of alien contact work had built into all of them, was the same. Do not make a thing larger than it needs to be, especially when the thing is fragile, especially when it belongs to someone else. They finished the act. Afterward, in the silence that fell naturally at the end of the scene, Florian said, very quietly, "She brought someone with her tonight." "Her mother," Basia said. She was standing 2 steps back, in the formal posture of someone who is not officially present, Florian said. She had the bioluminescent suppression pattern of someone watching without wanting to be seen watching, but her neck patches ran something I haven't seen in official broadcasts. He paused. "I've seen it twice, in the field. Once when a Vithian senior official was given information they had not expected. Once when the head of the Keth delegation said something at the table that changed the shape of the room." He looked at Jersey. "It's the expression for hearing something you recognize that you did not know you could recognize." Jersey was quiet for a long moment. "Good," he said, "then we perform." They set the full performance for the 14th day. They opened the corridor doors that connected to the small receiving area at Quarter 12's formal entrance, the space that had been designated, in the original charter, for official visitors, and which had received no official visitors in 11 years. They moved every chair from every room. Florian hung 2 lights from the ceiling track with electrical tape, and a degree of engineering confidence that was either impressive or alarming. Zofia positioned herself at the side with the makeshift instrument arrangement. She had assembled from components that were not individually instruments, but had in her hands become something that functioned as one, with the particular ingenuity of someone who has spent 40 years working with insufficient equipment and has stopped noticing the insufficiency. Jersey sent no invitations. There were protocols against unsolicited communication with members of the imperial family, and he had read those protocols carefully and found in them no prohibition against simply leaving the doors open. He left the doors open. He dimmed the corridor lights to what Florian estimated was the Vithian equivalent of theatrical dark. He stood in the receiving area and he began. He played it straight. No apologies, no context, no frame, just the opening lines of Faust spoken into the receiving area of a human welfare block that smelled of recycled air and basil, and the particular quality of time that accumulates in places where time is not expected to produce anything further. His voice was the voice of a man from Krakow who had spent 31 years making himself understood to beings who experienced language as ambient and chemical and chromatic, as something that happened in the whole body rather than just in the mouth, and who had found in the process that the only way to truly communicate across that gap was to mean what you were saying so thoroughly that the meaning came through even when the medium didn't. He meant it. Basia moved behind him with the weight and deliberateness of a trained body that has not forgotten how weight is supposed to move through space when the space means something. Victor descended into his role with the committed precision of someone who has spent 20 years saying no on behalf of others, and has found, in the formal permission of fiction, what it feels like to say it because you believe it. Zofia played what the music was made of, which was more than notes, and Florian ran the sound and watched the garden screen and kept his expression professionally empty. Beyond the screen, 2 figures. One small, her bioluminescence running free and bright and completely undisciplined, every color moving. One tall, standing 2 steps back, her expression unreadable in the dark, her neck patches running the slow, complex pattern that was not official broadcast and was not suppression but was something between the two, the expression of someone being changed by something before they've decided whether to allow it. They played it through. There were moments that faltered. Victor stumbled over a line he'd known cold in rehearsal, and covered it with the particular quick adaptation of someone who has been covering stumbles in formal settings for 2 decades. Basia's knee made itself known in a scene that required her to move in a way it was not prepared to accommodate, and she accommodated the knee instead, and what she produced was different from what they'd rehearsed and more honest. These were not failures. They were the specific quality of a performance that is happening rather than being reproduced. And at the end of Act 2, when Jersey spoke the lines that were the argument, he did not look at the garden screen. He looked at the room, which contained 8 human beings who had given everything they had to give to a work that had not asked them and would not thank them, and he said the words into that room with the full weight of what he knew them to mean. "Stay, thou art so fair." Not a declaration, a hope, the precise distinction that was the whole of what Goethe had been saying all along. In the garden, the child's bioluminescence ran a color that Zofia wrote down afterward in her notebook, in the careful hand she used for things she considered important findings. She did not share what she wrote, but later, when Jersey asked her what the color meant, she said, "The closest standard word is the one we've been using, something preserved from before that still works exactly as it was intended to." She closed her notebook. "In full form," she said, "the word also carries a sense of relief, as in it is still here, it has not been lost." The administrative review was postponed, without explanation, 12 hours after the performance. Then the Interior Administration request was formally withdrawn. Then the Quarter 12 charter was extended for a full additional review cycle by Personal Directorate of the Empress Rethal, effective immediately. Florian reported all of this at breakfast with the flat delivery of someone delivering news they do not entirely trust, because in 30 years of contact work, he had learned that the things you didn't trust were often the most real, because they were the ones you hadn't planned for, and therefore hadn't built a protective expectation around. "Is it permanent?" Jersey asked. "A personal directorate requires the Empress herself to reverse it," Florian said. "Anyone who wants to change the quarter's status has to convince her personally. They have to explain why she was wrong to issue it." He was quiet for a moment. "Which means they have to have a reason that is better than whatever reason she has for keeping it open, and they don't know what that reason is. It wasn't given officially." He looked at Jersey. "So they're arguing against something invisible, which is, in my experience, very hard to win." 2 weeks later, Jersey was on the path in the garden, the permitted path, within the designated human occupation zone, when the girl appeared at the garden entrance. She was not alone. A Vithian administrator stood 3 steps behind her, expression neutral, doing the official job of supervising a contact that was already, everyone present understood, beyond the administrator's authority to shape. Beside the administrator stood a tall woman in formal imperial robes, whose bioluminescent patterns moved with the controlled complexity of someone who had spent decades learning to mean exactly what she broadcast and no more. The girl walked to the boundary edge of the permitted zone and stopped. She was 9 years old by Vithian count. She had a diplomat's daughter's training, which meant she knew every rule about what you said to a human contact specialist in a formal meeting, and none of the rules applied to what she actually wanted to say. She looked back at the woman behind her. "Mother," she said, in Vithian court register formal that Jersey understood completely. "That's him." Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone presenting evidence they have been collecting for a long time, not excited, not uncertain, but utterly confident in the way of a child who has made up her mind about something important and is presenting the fact of it to the relevant adult authority without any expectation of being disbelieved. It was also, Jersey thought, the voice of a child who loved her mother enough to bring her here, who trusted her mother enough to say this in front of her, who needed her mother to see what she had been seeing. The Empress Rithal looked at Jersey. She had the assessing look of someone who had received a briefing and was now testing it against the original. But beneath the assessment, shifting slowly in the bioluminescent patterns he had spent 31 years learning to read, something else. The expression for hearing something you recognize that you did not know you could recognize. Specialist Malik, the Empress said, in careful standard that carried the accent of someone who had learned from a very good teacher. My daughter tells me you are not finished. He looked at the child, who was watching him with the open, total attention she'd had since the 4th day, the face of someone who has decided to see a thing directly and is not going to look away. No, he said, I don't believe I am. The Empress was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the Vithian garden grew its meaning-bearing shapes in patient rows, encoding in living things the logic of a civilization that had decided what it knew. Above them, the capital rose in its layers of engineered precision, a world that had been cataloging human beings for decades, and had reached a provisional conclusion that humans were interesting historically in the way preserved things are interesting, complete records of something that had been, not necessarily of something that was. We will have a discussion, the Empress said finally. Formal, diplomatic protocol, the full channels. She paused. Then she said something else, in the court register formal that is the language of declaration rather than administration, the register that carries legal and moral weight, the one that cannot be revised without everyone who heard it knowing it has been revised. We have not perhaps been watching correctly. It was a sentence that would take years to fully play out in policy. Jersey knew this. He also knew that it had been said in the register that meant it was already done. We would welcome the opportunity, he said, to be seen. The formal diplomatic session was scheduled for the following month. Jersey spent the intervening weeks writing, not a brief, not a proposal, not a policy document in any format the service recognized. He wrote a record. A human record, which is different from a diplomatic record in the way that a diary is different from a log. One is evidence, the other is experience, and only one of them captures what it had actually been like. He wrote about the Vithian market street at dawn, when the ambient declaration of 1,000 vendors starting their day built to something that felt, if you were willing to let it, like music. He wrote about the first time he'd understood a Vithian joke, not translated it, but felt the shape of what it was made of, the logic and the subversion of the logic and the communal pleasure of the subversion, which is what a joke is in any language. He wrote about a young Vithian technician, very early in his career, who had shown him shyly a collection of human music they had been quietly assembling, not for official cultural exchange purposes, but for themselves, because they couldn't stop listening to it, and they didn't know why, and they hoped Jersey might explain it. He had sat with them and listened and heard, through their listening, what human music sounded like to someone who had never expected beauty to come from vibrating air. He wrote about Henrik, who had sung in the corridors without knowing anyone was listening, and about what Florian had said, that she had started coming every morning when Henrik sang, and that after he died she had kept coming, but differently, the way you keep going to a place where something was, even after the something is gone. He sent it through the formal channels. He received no official acknowledgement. On the night before the diplomatic session, he sat at the window of Corridor 7 and watched the city. The capital cycled through its administrative day shift to night shift protocols, and the bioluminescent cultivars in the palace garden shifted their light from the gold of day function to the deep blue-green of night state, and the whole city broadcast, in its ambient way, the declaration of a civilization continuing to do what it had always done. He thought about Henrik. He thought about Zophia's notebook. He thought about a small alien girl who had been watching a human welfare block from behind a garden screen for 9 months, because she had seen something there that she could not stop looking at, and about her mother, who had extended the charter of that welfare block 3 times without giving a reason, and about the specific quality of a reason that you don't give because to give it would be to say that you had already decided, and you were not ready to be heard deciding. He thought about staying on paths not quite where the protocols said you should be. He thought not yet, not anywhere near. The session lasted 4 hours. It produced no formal agreement, 2 preliminary memoranda, and 1 moment that Jersey would carry for the rest of his life. The Empress was speaking to a room full of ministers and administrators and service officials about the parameters of what she was calling a renewed observational framework, which was diplomatic language, for we have been watching wrong and want to watch differently. A sentence that, spoken plainly, would require 3 years of procedural justification to get on record, and that, spoken in the elegant oblique of diplomatic administration, could be agreed upon in a single session. She paused mid-sentence. She turned and looked at the back of the room. The third daughter of the imperial line was sitting in a chair that was too large for her, her formal robes arranged with the slightly imperfect care of a child who had dressed formally on purpose, her bioluminescent patches running the warm amber of someone who is trying to maintain a composed expression and mostly succeeding. She was watching everything with the attention she had always had, the open, undiplomatized attention of someone who had decided a long time ago to see things directly. "Sail," the Empress said. The girl looked up. "Tell them," her mother said, "what you saw." The room was quiet. The girl was quiet for a moment that was exactly as long as it needed to be. Not the pause of someone uncertain what to say, but the pause of someone choosing the truest version of the thing they knew. "I saw someone who had not finished," she said. Her voice was clear. It was a child's voice, and it was also the voice of someone who has spent 9 months assembling evidence and knows the evidence is sound. "I saw them refuse to finish, and I saw," she stopped. Started again, more slowly, with the care of someone choosing words for the first time because the words they reach for first are never quite right. "I saw why humans keep doing things even when they are told to stop." Nobody in the room spoke. "Why do they?" the Empress asked. It was not a rhetorical question. It was the question she had been asking, through the charter extensions and the personal directorates, and the 3 years of watching without saying she was watching, and had brought her daughter here today to answer publicly and on the record. The girl thought about it for a moment, then, "Because the evening hasn't come yet," she said. Jersey, at the human delegation table, kept his face still with the professional ease of 31 years at tables like this. But Florian, sitting to his left, glanced sideways at precisely the right moment and saw it, the corner of Jersey's mouth, a fraction of movement, the expression that an old diplomat makes when something says the exact true thing in the exact right way. Florian made a note in his log, not an official note. The personal one he'd been keeping since 22, in the format he'd developed for recording things that wouldn't fit in official reports. Human subject, it said, exhibiting the ambient state that would translate in the Vithian register as finding again the thing you came here for. He closed the log. He didn't need to write what happened next. What happened next would be in the official records, in the preliminary memoranda, in the adjusted frameworks and the renewed observation protocols, and the policy documents that would accumulate in the years to come, as the conversation that had started from a garden screen expanded into channels it hadn't previously been offered. What happened next was history. What had happened first was 8 humans in a room that smelled of basil and recycled air, and the specific quality of effort, performing the truest story they knew for an audience that had been watching them for months because it could not look away. That evening, 11:15, was very quiet. Not the quiet of people who had nothing to say, but the quiet of people who were thinking in parallel, which is a different thing entirely. It has a weight to it, a density, the sense of a room full of ongoing work. Zofia wrote in her notebook. Basia sat with her screen off, looking at something that wasn't in the room. Victor was reading, actually reading, with the absorbed attention of someone who had decided that administrative efficiency was not the only thing worth giving attention to. Florian shuffled cards in the slow, repetitive way that meant he was using the cards the way some people use a pen, not to do anything with, just to have something in his hands while his mind was somewhere else. Jersey sat at the window of the common room and watched the garden. The bioluminescent cultivars had shifted to their night state pattern, deep blue-green and slow-moving, the ambient declaration of a city that was still here and continuing. In the garden below, a small figure moved along the cultivated rows, unhurriedly, touching the structured growth the way you touch things you want to remember, not possessively, not assessing, just present to them. She looked up at the window. She saw him. She made no gesture this time, formal or informal. She simply looked, for a moment, with the full attention she'd been giving the quarter for 9 months, and then she turned back to the garden and continued her walk. The basil smelled like effort. Florian shuffled his cards. Somewhere in the city, the Vithian capital breathed its alien breath, and the administrative frameworks that governed 17 years of human presence in this sector of space turned quietly on their axes towards something that had not, 3 months ago, been their direction. Jersey watched the garden until the figure disappeared between the cultivar rows. Not yet evening, he thought, not anywhere near. He had not been wrong about that. And he had known, standing in the receiving area of a human welfare block with the furniture pushed back and 2 lights on electrical tape, that he needed to be right about it, not for himself, though for himself too, but for all of them. For Henrik, who had sung in the corridors. For Zofia, who had turned a conservatory training into 40 years of notebooks. For Florian, who had logged everything and said nothing, and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that the right moment is real and cannot be forced. For Basia, whose knee held. For Victor, who had discovered in the formal permission of Mephistopheles something true about himself. For a child at a garden screen, watching, because what she saw was something she recognized that her own world had not given her a word for. That was the work. That was the whole of the work. Not the accords, not the policy frameworks, not the careful diplomacy of 31 years in rooms that smelled like ammonia. This, being seen, and having the thing that was seen be worth seeing. He had not been finished. He had known, when he walked down the boarding ramp with 1 bag and 1 cane, and the particular silence of a man who has been told he is no longer required, that this was not evening. He had not known what the morning would look like, but he had known it was not evening. He had been right. He was right. The night deepened over the capital, and the cultivar rows sent their blue-green declaration upward into the dark, and in a room that smelled of basil and recycled air, and the accumulated weight of people doing difficult things with insufficient equipment and no formal recognition, 8 human beings who had not been finished sat in the particular quiet of people who have been correctly seen, and were content, for now, to simply be. That was enough. That was the whole of what enough meant. The evening had not come. In the weeks after the session, the quarter received its first official visitor in 11 years. She came in the afternoon, when the grow lamp over the basil was at its warmest, and she came without announcement or formal protocol notice, which was itself a statement. The imperial family of the Vithian Empire did not go anywhere without announcement unless they were making a point about what kind of visit it was. The administrator who accompanied her had the look of someone who had raised several procedural concerns and had been overruled at every stage, with the serene certainty of someone who found procedural concerns interesting but not governing. Sale stood in the doorway of the common room and looked at the furniture, the cards, the grow lamp, the notebook, the screen. She looked at all of it with the unhurried attention of someone finally visiting a place they have studied from the outside. Her bioluminescence ran warm amber and the flickering gold blue of curiosity, and she made no attempt to regulate it, which was either because she didn't think it was necessary, or because she was too focused to remember to try. "You moved the furniture for the performance," she said. Her standard was formal and careful, better than Jersey had expected, which meant she had been studying, which told him something about the 9 months he hadn't been present for. "Pushed it to the walls." "Yes," Jersey said. "Can I see?" She glanced at him. "The way it was." He looked at Florian. Florian looked at Victor. Victor looked at Basia. Nobody objected, which in the common room of quarter 12 was the same as unanimous agreement. They moved the furniture. It took 10 minutes, which was the same 10 minutes it had taken before each rehearsal, with the same sequence of negotiations about which chair went where, and whose back was going to be an issue today, and whether the gap on the left side was large enough. Sale watched this entire process with a total, absorbed attention that Jersey recognized as the look of someone learning by watching. Not learning the content of what was being done, but learning how the people doing it were with each other, the texture of long shared work, the specific warmth of people who have done something difficult together and carry it between them as a kind of permanent shorthand. When the furniture was pushed back and the room had its performing shape, she stood in the center of it and looked around at the empty space. "It feels different," she said. "Yes," Zofia said from her corner without looking up from her notebook. "It does." "What is that?" the girl asked. "What makes it different?" Zofia considered this. She was 81 years old and had spent 40 of those years trying to describe Vithian ambient phenomena in standard terms that a human could understand, which was the reverse of what she was now being asked, and the reversal amused her in a way that did not show on her face but showed in the quality of the pause before she answered. "Expectation," she said. "The room expects something to happen in it. It holds the shape of what's been done here and waits for it to happen again." The girl thought about this for a moment. "Humans build that into rooms," she said. "Humans build it everywhere," Basia said from across the room. She was reading again, or had been. Her screen was face down. "It's one of the things we do. We use a space for something, and the space becomes partially made of that use. You can feel it in old theaters, in houses people have lived in for generations, in places where something important happened, even when all the visible evidence is gone." She paused. "I don't know if Vithian spaces do that." "Our cultivated spaces do," the girl said slowly, as if she was working this out as she spoke. "The garden holds what we've grown in it. It's different in places where something grew well and in places where it didn't. But I didn't know you could do it with a room. A simple room." "You can do it with a room," Zofia said, "if you mean what you do in it." The girl stood in the center of the common room, her bioluminescence running a slow, complex pattern. Then she said, "Will you do it again? The performance?" "Yes," Jersey said. "For who?" Jersey looked around the room, at Florian with his cards, at Basia with her screen, at Zofia with her notebook, at Victor standing by the window with the slightly less closed posture of someone who has been reminded of something they had forgotten about themselves. "For us," he said, "that's who it was always for." The girl was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then her bioluminescence ran a brief bright gold, involuntary, the color of a sudden understanding, and she turned to look at the administrator behind her. "We can go," she said. And then, as the administrator moved to open the protocol of departure, she turned back to Jersey and said, in court register formal, with the careful weight of someone who has been practicing a sentence, "Thank you for leaving the doors open." He recognized the register. He responded in kind. "Thank you," he said, "for coming in." Later, Florian said, "She'll come back." "I know," Jersey said. "Regularly, with official clearance probably once the new framework paperwork clears." Florian shuffled his cards. "The Empress will want her to. It's part of the thing now. The renewed observational framework." He paused. "We'll need new material." Jersey looked at him. "For the next performance," Florian said, Can't do Faust every time she's seen it. She'll want to see what else there is. Jersey thought about this. He thought about what else there was, the full width of what humans had made and preserved and carried forward against time and forgetting, and the administrative convenience of things that were no longer efficient. He thought about Henrik's song, which he didn't know the words to either, not properly, but which he could probably recover enough of to work with. He thought about the other stories. The other arguments humans made in the aggregate, about what kind of thing humanity was and why it kept going. "How much archive do you have?" he said. Florian considered. 40 years of human cultural production cataloged for xenolinguistic resonance analysis, music, theater, narrative, visual art, material culture documentation. He set his cards down. More than we could get through. "Good," Jersey said. They sat with that for a moment. The basil grow lamp hummed. Outside, the Vithian capital conducted its alien civilization in the amber light of late afternoon, and through the garden screen the cultivar rows sent their slow ambient declaration into the air. A message in a language that took decades to learn, in a place that Jersey had been told, very politely, was his final assignment. He thought not final, not close to final. He thought, we have a lot of work to do. Florian picked his cards back up and began to shuffle, slow and easy, with the comfort of long habit. Somewhere in the East Wing, in a garden full of meaning-bearing growth, a child with unregimented bioluminescence was probably walking between the rows. Her mother was probably reviewing preliminary memoranda in a language that Jersey could read, and that said, between its careful lines, something that no empress had said to the human contact program in 17 years. "We want to see you, all of you, everything you are and everything you have been and everything you are still becoming. We have not been watching correctly." He had 31 years of material to give them. He had 8 people in a welfare block and 40 years of archive, and a grow lamp that was almost the right spectrum, and a room that held the shape of what had been done in it. He had not been finished. None of them were finished. The evening had not come, and they had so much left to do in the light. The second performance was different from the first in the way that all true sequels are different, not bigger, not more polished, but deeper, because the people performing it knew more now. They knew the room. They knew what the room expected of them. They knew the audience, or some of them did, and they knew what that audience had been watching for and what they were hoping to see. This time, Sale brought 3 other children. Young Vithians, not imperial, the offspring of ministers and senior administrators, brought in carefully, with proper clearance, as part of what the official documentation was now calling a cultural witness initiative under the renewed human observational framework. The documentation was dry and procedural, and completely failed to capture what it was, which was a child who had seen something she wanted other children to see. They sat in a row, these 4 young Vithians, their bioluminescence creating a small landscape of moving light in the dark of the receiving area, and they watched with the particular attention of people seeing something for the first time that they have already been told, by someone they trust, is worth seeing. Victor played Mephistopheles with something he had not had in the first performance, which was the knowledge that the role was his. The first time, he had played it well from uncertainty, from the professional reflex of someone who has always done the competent thing and found it sufficient. This time he played it from somewhere deeper, from the part of himself that had spent 20 years explaining why things couldn't be done, and had found in that explanation a sincere belief that had taken the form of a devil's bargain. He was very good. He was better than any of them had expected. He was, Zofia said afterward, quietly, the best Mephistopheles she'd seen since a production in Warsaw in 1977, which was either high praise or a reference none of the rest of them could evaluate, but the quality of it was in her face when she said it. Basia moved through her role with the ease of someone who has moved through it before, and found that it accommodated her exactly. that the role had shaped itself around her limitations and her gifts in the way roles do when they are right, and that what had been improvisation was now interpretation, which is what rehearsal produces when the rehearsal is honest. Zofia played, Florian ran the sound, the basil grow lamp hummed. Jersey stood in the center of the room they had made into something that held the shape of performance and performed. He spoke the lines he had spoken before, and they were the same lines and not the same, because nothing is the same the second time. You bring the first time with you. You bring everything you learned from being wrong and right and surprised and humbled. You bring the specific texture of a room that has already been used for something and expects to be used for something again. He spoke the lines about the moment worth saving, about the thing worth asking to last, about the specific human act of reaching for what is already beginning to pass. In the row of watching children, Sale sat very still. Her bioluminescence was nearly quiet, not the controlled quiet of adult suppression, but the natural quiet of someone so absorbed in what they're watching that their body has simply stopped having ambient responses to anything else. She was entirely present. She had brought other children here because she needed them to see, and she was watching them see it, and what she felt about that was too complex for the developmental stage of her bioluminescent system to broadcast legibly. It simply ran, quiet and continuous, the color that had no standard translation. The color Zofia had identified as something preserved from before that still works exactly as intended, and in full form, relief that it is still here, that it has not been lost. When Jersey spoke the final lines, he felt the room. He had been told, in 31 years of contact work, by xenolinguists and cultural exchange specialists and theoretical xenobiologists, and the occasional diplomat who had been in the field long enough to develop opinions, that human performance was one of the things the Vithians found most difficult to categorize. Not because they couldn't observe it, they observed everything with tremendous thoroughness, but because the categorization required a principle, and the principle kept escaping them. Humans performed things that had already happened. They performed things that hadn't happened and never would. They performed their own pain for other people. They performed happiness they didn't feel, and sometimes the performing produced the feeling, and sometimes it didn't, and the distinction between those cases was not legible from the outside. They performed grief and called it celebration. They performed celebration in the face of grief. They performed in the largest halls they could build and in welfare blocks that smelled of basil. They performed for an alien audience that was still learning what it was seeing. What the Vithians had not previously been able to identify, and what was now being proposed, very carefully in the language of preliminary memoranda, was the principle. Humans performed because the performing was the point. Not the record of the thing, not the information conveyed, not the cultural data generated. The act itself. The act of choosing what to do with the time you have, and doing it fully, in the presence of others who are willing to be present to it, and finding in that act the evidence that you are still here and still reaching, and the evening has not yet come. Jersey finished the final lines. The room was quiet. 4 young Vithians sat in a row with their bioluminescence running colors that none of them had clearance to officially broadcast yet, running them anyway, because that was what they were doing, all of them, in this room that smelled of basil and recycled air and the weight of things done here, and the expectation of things not yet done. He looked at them. He thought, this is what we are. This is the whole of what we are. Not the history, not the records, not the administrative documentation of 31 years in alien contact work. This, a room where someone chose to mean something, and someone else chose to watch, and both of them were changed by it in ways that would take years to understand. This is what the child at the garden screen had seen. This is what she had brought her mother to see, and then brought others to see, and what she would keep bringing people to see as long as there was something here worth seeing. He was not finished. None of them were finished. There was so much left. He stood in the room that held the shape of what had been done in it, and was not yet evening, not anywhere near, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be.